upcoming election in Turkey could determine...
Cumhurbaşkanı Recep Tayyip Erdogan bugün önce sığınmacılarla sonra Cumhurbaşkanı Erdogan Twitter'da...
The headline, unsurprisingly, today is critical of the governing party.
Amerika'da bir New York Times diye paçavra.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're tracking this week. Turkey goes to the polls, and the media are in the government's sights. 2 Yemeni reporters, casualties of war. Were they being used as human shields? Washington has some new rules for the NSA, and Daniel Ellsberg, who blew the whistle on the war in Vietnam, has plenty to say about that, Edward Snowden, and the state of surveillance.
The situation has gotten more dangerous for whistleblowers, no question about it.
And on the internet, inspiration comes in many forms, but you won't find any in this video. Sometimes it's hard to tell if Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan is a politician or a media critic. Turks go to the polls Sunday, June 7th. President Erdogan, who used to be prime minister, wants the AK party to win enough seats in parliament to change Turkey's constitution and secure a new role for the presidency, which is currently a largely ceremonial position. In fact, Erdogan's name isn't even on the ballot in this election, but there is no more prominent figure in the campaign. President Erdogan, and to a lesser extent, the Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, have been fixated on the media, the way the AK party is covered both inside Turkey and out. In just the past week, Erdogan has publicly accused the editor of the Cumhuriyet newspaper of espionage, and he's slammed the New York Times for holding a grudge against him and Turkey itself. Go back a few weeks and you'll find a litany of accusations, arrests, reporting bans, and court convictions against journalists. In many cases, Erdogan has targeted media outlets associated with the reclusive US-based cleric Fethullah Gulen. Gulenists who once supported the AK party have turned, and Erdogan accuses the movement of trying to form a parallel state to bring down the government. There's a lot on the line in this election, including the future, at least in the short term, of Turkish journalism. Our starting point this week is Istanbul. On May 25th, 2 weeks before the election, President Erdogan went after the New York Times over an editorial entitled "Dark Clouds Over Turkey." He said the paper was meddling in Turkey's affairs when it referred to Erdogan's brute manipulation of the political process, his long history of intimidating and co-opting the Turkish media, and how the president is increasingly hostile to truth-telling. Turkey has more than 70 national television channels, almost 40 national newspapers, and over the years, President Erdogan has taken issue with many of them. But on this occasion,
New York Times, haddini bilecek.
When he said the Times had overstepped the limits of freedom, he chose a more distant target, a strategic one.
Erdoğan düşman yaratma stratejisi.
Erdogan's strategy is to create enemies. He's using enmity towards the United States via the New York Times to create the feeling of a leader standing up to the world.
Amerika'da bir New York Times diye paçavra.
Whereas we know very well that he actually came to power with US support and with the enormous credit given to him by the American press, of which the New York Times is also a part. Now he is trying to make us forget that.
Şimdi onu unutturmaya çalışıyor.
Yine de New York Times'te görüyoruz.
The New York Times went too far by describing Erdogan as a dictator or intending to be one. I think this is a premeditated campaign against the government. In the US and in other countries, there are media groups cooperating with a parallel state in Turkey.
Turkey, under Tayyip Erdogan's leadership, has seen its press freedom credentials plummet. The Committee to Protect Journalists, based in New York, says that over the past 3 years, the country has jailed as many or more journalists than China, which has almost 20 times the population. The government has been so heavy-handed with media outlets that self-censorship is rife, to the extent that when the Gezi Park protests erupted in 2013, many of those outlets did their best to avoid covering the story, at least initially, until protesters shamed them into doing their jobs. The self-censorship is rooted in corporate self-interest. Most major media outlets in Turkey are owned by conglomerates. They are diversified, and their investment in media is minute compared to their other holdings, many of which do big business with the government and don't want their news outlets to jeopardize that. One of those conglomerates, Doğan Holdings, owns Cumhuriyet. When the paper reported that former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi had been sentenced to death, the headline referred to Morsi once winning 52% of the popular vote, the same figure Erdogan polled in 2014. The picture did not feature Morsi, it was Erdogan's.
Doğan grubu, sen de avucunu daha çok yalarsın.
A lawyer acting on Erdogan's behalf went to prosecutors demanding an investigation, saying that the paper was inciting an armed rebellion and spreading terrorist propaganda. The government has since banned the parent company, Doğan, from bidding on government contracts. Last week, another paper, Cumhuriyet, published video from 2014, allegedly showing Turkish intelligence services delivering weapons to Syria. Erdogan called it slander, an act of espionage, and said that the editor would pay a heavy price. Cumhuriyet's journalists went on their front page as an act of solidarity with their editor, who says that the Turkish media are under pressure.
Bir suçu anında
We recorded, documented, and showed our readers a crime. Because they were caught in the act just before an election, Erdogan got into a panic and made these accusations, raising the intensity of criticism and pressure that he levels at the media. We're talking about a government that is increasingly becoming an authoritarian regime, and so these elections are becoming a life and death struggle. If they lose this election, they will be called to account for a great many things.
Birçok şeyin hesabını vermek zorundalar.
In Turkey, the press is very free in all areas as far as we are concerned, unless there is extreme defamation which exceeds the limits of criticism. Turkey is a very open society, and there are newspapers and television channels with different orientations. Turkey is not a place where someone is immediately prosecuted for criticizing the president. However, if there are those who go beyond criticism and engage in defamation, he can bring a case against them.
And the government has other ways. In 2009, when Cumhuriyet's owners, Doğan Holdings, fell out with Erdogan, they were suddenly hit with a $1 billion fine for back taxes. These days, the government's big fight is with media groups associated with the Islamic cleric Fethullah Gulen, whose religious and social movement runs schools and universities in Turkey and elsewhere. Like Doğan Holdings, the Gulen movement initially backed Erdogan. Newsrooms affiliated with Gulen helped get the AK party elected before they fell out and those media outlets grew critical. These days, the government calls Gulenists the parallel state. And in December, police raided newsrooms linked to Gulen and arrested more than 24 journalists.
Fethullah Gulen himself is abroad, but the organization he leads possesses press and broadcast institutions, newspapers and television channels, and they very openly report news against the government.
Türkmenler meselesi bu. Herhalde yani insan beyinsiz, geri zekalı, aptal olması lazım buna inanması için.
Before an election, they report news in a manner that very strongly supports the opposition. They are also being investigated by the judiciary. We, the administration, believe it is important to leave this to the judiciary.
First of all, the Gülenist is not a term that we accept. The affiliation of the media group, Zaman, Today, Zaman and others, there is no such an affiliation. Mr. Gülen is an inspiring leader. Zaman Group and Samanyolu and also Cihanlis Agency may be taking some inspirations from Gülen's ideas to establish these institutions, but in terms of ownership and in terms of editorial policy, Gülen has no impact on any of these outlets.
However, when Gulenist news outlets, which deny that they're Gulenist, feel the wrath of the Erdogan government, which denies it's interfering with the judicial process, the Gulenists tend to forget one important piece of context, which is difficult to deny.
If Gulenist media are in Erdogan's sights, it's partly because these are media that he himself nourished and raised, and which he now accuses of treachery. The AK party and the Gulen movement ran the country together for years. Then there was a conflict of interests. Erdogan has now declared as his enemy a media group that previously supported him wholeheartedly, that had grown and prospered under his wing. Frankly, the crime of the Gulenist media is that they stayed silent about pressure on journalists when it wasn't directed against them.
It is against that media landscape that Turks cast their ballots this weekend. an outright war between former allies, a tangled web of corporate interests that compromises the news organizations trying to report on politics, and a president accused, both at home and abroad, of growing more and more authoritarian. That's the media story in Turkey, but not enough journalists are in a position to tell it. On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the Turkish election.
When Recep Tayyip Erdogan first campaigned for the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, in 2002, he very much reached out to the media to get out his message. A decade plus later, we see a different Erdogan, an Erdogan who clamps down on the media, on free speech, imposes censorship, and jails journalists. That change very much has to do with the style of leadership that Erdogan believes resonates with a constituency in the Anatolian heartland.
Türkiye'de hükümetin verdiği reflekslere bakarsak daha şuursuz, daha kontrolsüz olduğunu görebiliriz. Son dönemde özellikle Can Dündar'ın Cumhurbaşkanı'yla bir resleşmesi oldu. Ama şu an verilen refleksler daha şuursuz, daha kontrolsüz gibi geliyor bana.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. In Yemen, 2 television journalists have been found dead after an airstrike by Saudi-led coalition forces. Abdullah Kabil, a reporter for Belkis TV and Yemen Youth TV, and Yusuf Al-Aizari, a reporter for Suhail TV, disappeared May 20th, allegedly abducted by Houthi militiamen. According to the Yemeni journalists syndicate, they were then taken to an earthquake monitoring station that was bombed May 21st. The Paris-based media freedom advocates Reporters Without Borders blamed the Houthis for the deaths. The channels that the journalists worked for said that the Houthis used the reporters as human shields. On June 1st, Houthi rebels released Casey Coombs, an American freelance reporter who writes for The Intercept and Time magazine, among others. He had been abducted for about 2 weeks. BBC FM radio broadcasts into Rwanda have been blocked by the government there due to what Kigali calls abuse of press freedom and free speech. The suspension follows a documentary that aired on the BBC last year dealing with the 1994 genocide. It was called Rwanda's Untold Story. The country's broadcast regulator set up an investigative committee which concluded that the BBC violated its own editorial guidelines, transgressed journalistic standards, and violated Rwandan laws. The film suggested that President Paul Kagame and his Rwanda Patriotic Front had a hand in shooting down the plane of Kagame's predecessor, which triggered the genocide. The documentary also questioned the number of Tutsis killed. A spokesman for the organization has been quoted saying the corporation stands by its right to produce our independent journalism and strongly rejects any suggestion that the documentary constitutes genocide denial. Fake news websites are proliferating across the web, and some public figures and the media keep confusing their satirical stories for genuine articles. The latest to fail to fact-check is Jack Warner, a former vice president of FIFA, world football's governing body. Indicted on corruption charges May 27th, Warner tried to defend himself through a homemade video.
And then I looked to see,
citing a news piece from an American site. It turns out he was quoting The Onion, the most popular American fake news portal. In 2012, China's People's Daily completely bought a piece in The Onion, announcing that North Korea's Kim Jong-un was the sexiest man alive, and it ran a 55-photo slideshow to back up The Onion story. Sometimes, though, it's Western publications that take the bait. In 2013, the Pan Arabia Inquirer, a Middle Eastern onion, reported that Emirates Airlines was about to introduce shisha lounges, smoking lounges, on its flights. The French news agency AFP was among those to report that as fact. On June 5th, 2013, 2 years ago this week, Edward Snowden, a former U.S. National Security Agency contractor, revealed that intelligence agencies, through rules laid down in the U.S. Patriot Act, were systematically tracking Americans' phone records and collecting their emails through a series of surveillance tools. However, this week, the U.S. Congress handed the whistleblower a small victory. It refused to renew clauses in that Patriot Act regarding surveillance. Instead, Congress passed the USA Freedom Act, which means that the NSA will now need a court order before acquiring the phone records of Americans. Daniel Ellsberg knows what Edward Snowden has gone through. The former military analyst was the first whistleblower prosecuted in U.S. history. He was the source for the Pentagon Papers, which in 1973 revealed a quite different picture of the Vietnam War, that it was basically unwinnable, as opposed to what Americans were being told at the time by their leaders. And in 1975, when the last American soldiers were airlifted out of Saigon, Ellsberg was credited for helping end that war. Like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning before him, Daniel Ellsberg faced legal consequences for blowing the whistle. And over the past few years, Ellsberg, who's now in his 80s, has reemerged from his retirement in California as an advocate for those who want to get the truth out. He spent this past week on a 4-city whistle-stopping tour of Europe in support of whistleblowers. We got to sit down with him in London. Daniel Ellsberg, it's nice to have you here at the Listening Post. We've tried to get you into the chair before, but it's taken us a while.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Can we start by rewinding back to the first time you opened a newspaper or went online or flipped on your television set and saw the Edward Snowden story? Take me back to that day and tell me whether you saw a little bit of yourself in what he was doing.
Well, very much. I identify very strongly with Edward Snowden and with Chelsea Manning. When Chelsea Manning said to her informant she was ready to go to prison for life or even be executed, quote, to get out this information, I thought, I haven't heard anyone else say that for 40 years. That's the way I felt in 1969 and 1971. And it had taken a long time to hear somebody else act on that. Well, I thought it might be another 40 years, but 3 years went by only, and we had Ed Snowden. So I thought, again, I'm happy it hasn't taken 40 years. For someone, as Snowden put it, there are things worth dying for.
You have said that there's no material difference in what you did, the information you released, and what a Manning or a Snowden made available. But in your case, there were 7,000 pages of documents. You read every single one of them before handing them to the New York Times. Mm-hmm. There were hundreds of thousands of documents in Snowden's case, more than 1 million in Manning's. So is there not a case to be made that what they did might have been a tad more reckless than what you did in 1971?
There were certainly risks in it in that they couldn't judge entirely, obviously, what problems might arise from some material they hadn't read in detail. If they'd asked me to put it out, for example, I would at that time have been reluctant to put out material that I hadn't read. I wouldn't have done it, as a matter of fact. But in retrospect, having seen what was charged in both cases and then what actually happened, I think I was too cautious.
I suppose what it comes down to is that they trusted the journalists that they were going to work with.
Right.
Manning was trusting WikiLeaks, who then entrusted The Guardian and the New York Times.
Having seen what journalists did with Manning's material and with Snowden's material, I would say, yes, you can afford to trust their judgment. On the one hand, I would trust, from experience now, Manning's judgment and Ed Snowden's judgment. And perhaps better than that, though, I would trust the judgment of editorial staffs and news staffs who can go over this material, assign people to look at it, to redact what needs to be redacted, a job they couldn't do for themselves. So I think they did it pretty much exactly right, and against my own initial instincts.
You took your story to the New York Times in 1971, and Edward Snowden avoided doing that. He has specifically said that he had problems with some of the Times' journalism around 2004 through to 2006, when they actually had a story on warrantless wiretapping, and they held it at the behest of the administration until after the elections. How different a journalistic institution is the New York Times today to the one that it was back in 1971 when you were dealing with it?
Well, 9/11 has intervened, and so I think the media in general are all more afraid, more responsive to that threat. We will blame you for the next terrorist attack. If and when there is one, you can be sure that the press will be blamed, whatever they've done. President Obama has not refrained from saying, you will be responsible if you let the Patriot Act expire. And that threat makes people heal. It's like whipping them into servility very much. And so it isn't so much the times that has changed, I think, as the environment.
Congress refused to renew the sunset clauses in the Patriot Act. Then came the Freedom Act. That would mean that though all those phone records would no longer be collected and held by the NSA, those phone records will still be held by those phone companies, leaving the NSA the option to go through a court process to then get at that phone. Now, Snowden's lawyer, who you know, Jesslyn Radak, said that this is one small step in what should be a long ladder of meaningful surveillance reform. How small a step is it? How many more steps need to be taken?
I saw somebody called it a historic baby step. That's the most you could possibly say for it. To the extent that the mass surveillance continues, basically, whoever holds it, and it is accessible to the NSA, and of course with a warrant, but that's the only way it should ever have been accessible. I would say essentially we're seeing no change whatever so far. The entire struggle remains to be fought on this issue. But we wouldn't have seen that challenge and that effort without Snowden.
More and more prominent voices in America have come out in support of Snowden. The congressional votes also show that there is a momentum there.
Yeah, a movement, yeah.
But if you're another American whistleblower right now and you've got some secrets that you'd like to divulge, and you look at Edward Snowden, you see that he's not sitting in Hawaii with his girlfriend. He's in exile in Moscow. So the chill remains, doesn't it?
Oh, the chill is there, definitely, and it's more chilling than ever before because telling secrets of the organization to outsiders is not a good career move. Now, if you add to that the classification issue in the national security issue, you will also be called a traitor in the most serious sense, in a technical sense. What's new under Obama, being prosecuted and the likelihood of going to prison for a long time, whether it's 32 months, like John Kiriakou, who revealed the name of a torturer in CIA. Jeffrey Sterling, just been 42 months, another a real whistleblower. Chelsea Manning, 35 years. The situation has gotten more dangerous for whistleblowers, no question about it. Edward Snowden, if he came back here, I think would have to look forward to life in prison.
Finally, you recently turned 84 years of age. You're touring Europe, doing 4 cities in a week, talking about these issues. Aren't you at the stage of your life where you should be spending more time with your grandchildren? You live in California, I don't know, working on your golf swing. Mm-hmm. What keeps you out here?
Well, I'm really supposed to be spending my time on, as my publisher knows, on a deadline that has been extended several times for Bloomsbury Press. But what keeps me from doing that is that these issues keep arising, actually. That's my excuse. Sometimes when people ask me, how come you're still at it? I say, well, they're still at it, so I'm still at it.
I look forward to talking to you again once the book comes out. Daniel Ellsberg,
I'll be happy to do it.
It's been a rare pleasure.
Thank you.
Finally, sometimes when we're looking for something to end the program with, we go to YouTube for inspiration, and it turns out that that's actually a genre. The YouTube inspirational video, life gurus uttering universal truths to upload and uplift, often in the form of rap. Last month, Peter Gilroy of the comedy troupe Nacho Punch came up with a parody to prove that there is a formula for profundity, right down to the cadence with which the message is delivered. It's had at least 600,000 views on YouTube, and the comedian's defamation of inspiration, his simulation of the online conversation, is this week's final destination. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Did you know the average person spends a year of his life watching inspirational YouTube videos without actually making a difference? The average person will believe what I'm saying because I talk in a cadence that sounds thought out and factual, when in the actual, it has no meaning. It sounds like I'm saying something, but really I'm just saying some things. This isn't too hard to do. Simply take a phrase and reverse it, but make sure to do it fast because if you're not too careful, the phrase might reverse you. I can talk nonsense about higher conscience and tell you, don't be fooled by the media because the media is fooled by the don't. For real though, like books aren't food, so what the hell are they? Food for thought. It should be a crime that because I rhyme, you think I'm a philosopher. But really, that's just preposterous. And at the end of these videos, they like to summarize their points from top to bottom, but it's all a bunch of lies. Because we need to like and subscribe to life. I know.